Okay, so I'm just going to introduce you to the two different projects that I worked on, because I worked on both the Ada and the Buddha projects. And generally speaking, my use case is what Peter referred to as the full text search. My original research project for the analytical access to the domain dark archive was based, it was very much part of my PhD research, and it was to do with the online reception of the Liverpool poets, and in practice that ended up being Adrian Henry in particular. And I thought that with a domain dark archive, I could find avenues such as fan pages and fora and the like, which would provide me with information to consider alongside the archival research I was undertaking and the interviews that I was doing as well. I wanted to look at what labels were attached to the poets, how they were viewed in informal discussions and non-academic contexts. I knew already that there was a marked difference in how they were viewed in academia and in non-academia. And I thought that the internet archival searches would be able to provide evidence for how the people who actually experienced the work viewed these poets. And when I proposed this project, it was very much based on a wish list of tools that we wanted. There was an initial consultation period, and I believe there was one for science-based researchers and one for humanities-based researchers, where we sat in a room and went, these are the kinds of things that we would like the Web Archive to do. And some of those tools were things like sentiment analysis. And for me, I said, yeah, absolutely, that's what I want. I want to look at sentiment analysis. But over the course of the actual research, it became increasingly obvious to me and to other researchers as well that perhaps these weren't quite as useful as we thought they were going to be, or that we had made assumptions based on our sort of traditional research that couldn't work in this context. So just to briefly discuss sentiment analysis, you have to be so careful with the results. The sentiment analysis tool did work, but when you get a web page, often the sentiment of the whole page doesn't match up to the sentiment of the specific bit of that page that you're looking at. So you either get that, so for example, I had 11 very negative results for Adrian Henry, and when I went in and read each of those pages, none of them were negative specifically in relation to Henry himself. And the other side of that was also that the sentiment analysis tool seemed to throw up most results as being overall neutral, that pages were just, there were various different words that were used for sentiment analysis, and the pages just came back as being neutral rather than positive or negative. So that turned out to be something that I thought was going to be a brilliant resource for me, and I sort of had to reassess my assumptions. And I think Peter has a really lovely phrase that he's used before, that there are no false results, there are only false assumptions. That it is not that the data that's coming back is wrong, it's that you don't know how to look at it properly. And I think that really what I learned as part of the Ada project was that digging down was absolutely essential. And at that point, digging down was possible because we were only working on 1/10 of the total amount of items within the database. And I very much felt at the time when I wrote my final report that I was giving out a kind of warning to people not to make assumptions about the data. And I sort of we stood up in a conference in Vienna and just said, here are all the ways in which I am wrong, which was quite liberating actually as a researcher. For the second project that I was involved in, Buddha, I think I was definitely armed with the knowledge of what had occurred in the first phase, and I was looking at poetry networks online. This was part of my work on poetry communities of the British underground, where often you have, for example, a little magazine that's published in Birmingham that's publishing a letter talking about the scene in Exeter, and then this is being read by somebody in Newcastle, completely bypassing the Metropolitan. And I wanted to know if this had been translated to the internet, if sort of, it sounds trite, but if the internet had made the global local. And I ended up finding that there were two extremes for these kinds of networks online. There were what I call placeholder sites, which sort of only existed in order to get people offline and into poetry in the real world. And also forums where people from all over the world could get together and post poems and comment that in a way that they would not have been able to do without the internet. And I won't go into that in too much detail, but I definitely feel that my experience with Buddha was much more positive, and I came to this project with a much better understanding of what web archives actually are. Also, the tools that were available to us were much more user-friendly. The Shine search interface, which Peter showed you earlier, works really well. I mean, there was a particular problem I had originally with Boolean searching, with like how near is near, and with the Shine interface you can change the proximity search yourself, so you don't have that issue. Being able to save searches and come back to them later. These were all things that we couldn't do in the first phase that became much more useful later on. People have mentioned crawl dates as opposed to publishing dates, which was something that we said right from the very beginning needed to be absolutely understood. And I think that the way that the results are now shown and displayed, it is obvious to me which is what the crawl date is, and that the crawl date is not necessarily the publication date. And I think that's really the one thing that I would want researchers to take away from this workshop, is to learn how to treat the web archive as something that is different to other archives and other resources you may have used before. Rona, who was one of our colleagues on the Buddha project, came up with quite a good way of thinking about it. She said, don't think of it as Google, think of it as a large room full of unsorted archive material that you are free to wade through. For literary historians like Rona and myself, who spend quite a bit of time in traditional archives, that really sort of makes absolute sense. You are clicking through on these links, not knowing what they're going to be, and sometimes they're incredibly useful, and that's fantastic, and sometimes they're not. But you don't know until you've tried. You don't know until what the untapped resource is going to be until you've tapped it. I definitely benefited from being part of these two projects, but what I would say ultimately is that web archives are not a quick fix to just downloading a pile of useful results. You absolutely have to learn how to dig down, and it is different from non-web archive research.
Thank you, Helen. Does anyone have any questions for Helen about specifically what she... No, that's fine. You can bring it up. Who's... Gareth, are you going next, or am I going next?
I'm going next, I think.
Going next. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Right, well, I was in a similar sort of situation to Helen, although I didn't do the ARDA project, so I came into this sort of wide-eyed and bushy-tailed and naive, effectively. And my work was on disability organisations, because I'd recently finished a PhD on disability organisations from 1965 to 1995, and by coincidence, the Web Archive starts in 1996. So I thought, oh, this will be an interesting way of me carrying on doing what I was doing. And with it being the internet and being disability as well, there were a couple of things that really got me very interested. The first was this was just after the Disability Discrimination Act, which was an incredibly important piece of legislation, and why I'd finished my PhD in 1995 as a sort of a nice end point. So to see what disability organisations did after winning that, massive scare quotes, of course, winning this major victory, what did they then go on to do next? I thought that'd be interesting to look at. Also, with it tying into disability, there is this sort of general popular narrative, at least, that the internet is a liberator for those who have reduced mobility. There are issues for people who have sight impairment and dyslexia and various other sorts of forms of disability, but at face value, at least, the internet opens up a lot of possibilities. So were disability groups taking advantage of these possibilities? How early were they able to get in? Because your other sort of counter to that is quite a lot of disabled people are in poverty, so can they afford a PC, especially in the 1990s? And So that then moved on for me to think, were the tactics employed by these organisations going to be different in the late 90s and 2000s? Partially because they're moving on to new battles, and partially because the internet is sort of a new tool. I'd already found that disability organisations in the 80s, for example, the rise of the microcomputer and better telephony meant that it was easier for disability organisations to pump out leaflets and semi-academic work. So I wondered whether that would continue and if anything would increase. So my overall sort of research question was, how much information was there on the sort of early internet in the UK for disabled people? And what I found pretty early on was that was far too nebulous a question to be able to answer with the tools that we've got. And I think even if I had the tools, it would still be a ridiculously open question. So I started going about that by doing the sort of the naive thing that you would do with Google. You put in keywords and you find out how many results you get for those keywords and try to draw some kind of conclusions from that. And there were some interesting sort of things about being able to show how often the word disability appears, and watching graphs go up and down and all these other kind of things. But that wasn't particularly useful because I didn't have anything to really compare it against. I mean, was disability, for example, more important than any other civil rights issue at the period? You'd need to do a lot of keyword searches to be able to compare those things. So I changed tack and looked at the names of leading organisations to see which ones got mentioned more, on the sort of the basic assumption that if a organisation is mentioned more in the database, then they've done better at talking to different people, getting their name out there, and people are linking to them, talking about them. But then it becomes quite obvious that a group like Mind, if you put the word mind into the internet, you are going to get a lot of results, and most of them are going to have absolutely nothing to do with disability. And even if they do, the chances of them having anything directly to do with the organisation Mind are pretty slim. And the second you try to add sort of other words to it, so mind and disability, or mind and disability and organisation, does that then mean that that result isn't actually comparable to the result of another organisation? And once you get beyond that, even if you do decide that you've managed to pull up a list of web pages that are to do with a particular organisation, the one that I tended to stick with was the RNIB, because RNIB is you can be almost certain that if somebody's used that string, they're talking about the Royal National Institute for Blind People. Once you get into that, you get into all sorts of problems, because one of the things that the RNIB did very successfully was get in touch with other organisations such as the Web Accessibility Initiative, and loads of UK websites put on the bottom of their page follows the RNIB guidelines. They had absolutely nothing to do with visual impairment or the organisation itself. Now that was an interesting result, and I found that interesting as a sort of on a qualitative level as a historian, and that was a useful conclusion for me on a personal level. But in terms of going back to the original point of what I was trying to do here, it wasn't particularly useful. And it was also very clear that even if I did that, how could I compare that to the work of Radar or MENCAP or anybody else? Because the corpuses that I was able to get for each individual organisation were going to be different, and there wasn't really a way of comparing like with like. So what I've basically done since is to go back to the first principles of what I was trying to do, and trying to not necessarily reform the overall question per se, but think about ways of getting to what I was really interested in. And what I was interested in was how voluntary organisations behaved in the early web. It wasn't so much to do with trying to find everything that was written about disability organisations and trying to find all of the information that disabled people had. It was more about trying to work out how disabled people through their organisations were using the internet and using it to do political campaigns. That's what I was interested in. So that's what I went back to. Now, there were a number of different things that I could have done and have started to do, and probably much more could be done with. So the first thing that I noticed is that we talk about corpuses and corpora, and we talk about building up this sort of body of information. And the words already come up, can we build a manageable corpus? I think we need to think a little bit, before we even think about getting a manageable corpus, either to be human readable or machine readable, we need a consistent corpus. We need to be able to pick a series of items that we know are very likely to be related to each other. One of the ways of doing that, and one of the ways that I would do this, is to take some of the leading disability organisations and just take the pages on their websites over the period 96 to 2010. And then you've got yourself a corpus of pages that we know have been published by disability organisations. And then you can start to do things with that. You can do linguistic analysis, you can start doing link analysis, and you can start seeing where they're linking out to, whether they're linking to each other, and start to draw some conclusions there. Another thing that you can do is to go back to sort of good old-fashioned documentary history and treat each web page or each website as a document in itself, and go to the RNIB web page in 1997 and have a look at how it's laid out. How do they use images? What text do they put in there? What do they consider to be news? What is at the foreground, above the fold, so to speak? You know, what do you have to scroll down to? What's in your face? Why have they made those decisions, and does that say anything about the way that the organisation is trying to present itself to the rest of the world? And then you can start to do comparisons between them. And one of the interesting ones that I did find was between the RNIB and a group called the BCODP, who were a sort of a left-wing Marxist group who have been academically very important for disabled people in terms of the way that they've formulated disability rights, but never had anywhere near the kind of financial backing of RNIB. And it was very interesting to see how that financial backing kind of represented itself in the quality, in sort of as a sort of a nebulous term, of the RNIB website at various points in time versus the BCODP. You know, one was updated more often, one had better quality images, one had a lot more information on it, and those sorts of things. So that's basically the lessons that I've learned through failure, really, is to there was nothing inherently wrong per se with the stuff that I was interested in, but you need to formulate the questions in a way that you can actually get something from the data we have. And one of the key things that you need to be able to do there is to have some kind of consistency in what you're looking at. And the way that I found the best way of doing that was to go back to just taking the websites themselves. The problem that I would leave you with on that is that the whole point of this was to test the Shine interface and the search interface. And what I've just proposed doesn't require much searching. In fact, it requires previous information and prejudices about which websites would be important. And there is a question there as to whether I'm giving importance to groups that actually, if I were to do more discovery, I would find probably aren't even the ones that I want to look at. So, yes.
Questions? Comments? Okay. I'm on next, aren't I, Peter? Yep. Okay. I was interested in looking at, I was involved with both the Ada and the Buddha projects, looking at the phenomenon of Euroscepticism. So very much a political question in that sense. And I thought this maps in lovely because, you know, Britain's relationship to European integration goes back 50 years, but it certainly from the mid-1990s onwards became very much a larger political issue with the rise of Euroscepticism and various movements, individuals, and also within political parties favoring a reconsideration of Britain's relationship to Europe. And that dovetailed very nicely with the Domain Dark Archive from 1996 onwards. So in some ways, slightly different than Gareth, who kind of is the next logical step. Mine, I thought this maps on very nicely to the rise of Euroscepticism and its ups and downs, if you will, over the last almost 20 years. So I thought this would be excellent, and I thought this should be very revealing, not least because I was well aware that a lot of the debates, a lot of the movements, a lot of the individuals had used the web, had put things online, etc., had either their own websites or commented on other things, etc. So what I was interested in was three real research questions over the course of the two projects that moved on. First of all, I wanted to get a sense of when did the debate and how did the debate develop online? And did that map or differentiate with more public debates in newspapers, etc.? And in how did those map or connect with some of the key events, such as the beginning of the Euro and the Lisbon Treaty, etc.? So I was interested in see, can I get an understanding when an online presence starts and how does that develop? And then to see how that connects with major events, to see whether there was an increase, if you will, a spark when those big events were engaging. And one of the other things I wanted to get a sense of was a connection, because a lot of these movements, UKIP, for example, were disparate movements. There is a central thing, but there's also a lot of the local. And I wanted to try to get a sense, can I get a sense from the web of the interaction between the center and the local? In other words, how independent, how offline, how on message were they trying to do? So I had some very broad questions, which I thought the web should give me some interesting, and analyzing using the web archive should give me some interesting answers to those questions. Well, I think I'll touch on four things that will sort of show some minor successes and, as Helen indicated, a lot of recognition of failure in that sense, or as Gareth puts it, more realism in terms of what you can get out of the web. So first of all is to do with results. And in that sense, there was lots of success. There was, unfortunately, too much success. And I think that's the problem. I had massive number of hits when I was putting in my search terms, when I was using Boolean search, etc. And we're talking hundreds of, by the time we had the full full access there, hundreds of thousands of hits, even if I was limiting it down, getting down to tens of thousands. And in my approach to trying to do qualitative research, in other words, to look at each of those individual websites, those individual returns, that was extraordinarily problematic. And in fact, it was not doable. And then I had to realize that there was this big problem of too much data, too much research data, and what to do about that. And I'll probably touch on some of the things, different ways in which I experimented with trying to limit that down. Sampling was one way in which I was trying to do that. And changing keyword search terms, limiting it down to, in a similar fashion to what Gareth done, to one particular organization, UKIP, for example. And all of those did help to reduce the overall numbers, the amount of big data there, but it didn't help to resolve the wider kind of a question of what do I do, even if you end up with under 10,000 results, that's too much to look at qualitatively to deep read each of those ones in that traditional method. And there wasn't a particular way in terms of the way in which you got your results that allowed me just to say, I can focus on only these ones, because you get random returns. Okay, so the first was, the first point, I suppose, was too much success, too many results, and the problems of big data. The second thing, I did get lots of interesting search results in terms of useful material, but as a research methodology, the problem was they seemed to be serendipitous. There didn't seem to be a way in which I could isolate how I got those results. So, for example, I found one of the earliest speeches of Farage, which was very, very interesting, very revealing, a particularly useful interview with Malcolm Rifkin from the 1990s, references to Utopia, which was E-Utopia, which was a documentary series that was there, which I wasn't aware of, and a recognition. I found numerous offsites of URLs to ukip.org, eukip.org, independent.org, etc. So I found lots of good bits of information, but I couldn't get a sense of a process in which I could justify the methodology for finding those. They were haphazard. They were serendipitous results. And that was problematic in that sense, to be able to draw wider overall conclusions. In terms of quantitative, looking at things quantitative using the Ngram, for example, that Peter mentioned before, there I was trying to see, do I have those trends? That question in relationship to the raw, I expected an increase in websites and web results in relation to the Eurosceptics, and I certainly got that, but I didn't get any sense of mapping or correspondence with some of the key events. So I didn't get sparks. In some ways I got opposite results, and I couldn't figure that out, and I still don't know how to figure that out. Whether that is a question of the nature of the data, whether there's a question of the problem there, whether I didn't have a big enough sample, I don't know. And in that sense, that was another area where I failed, or I didn't get the results that I wanted to. And what can I say overall? I mean, certainly I could say overall that I could clearly see online that there was a growth in the phenomenon of Euroscepticism. It has a very strong web presence, something I expected, but certainly it was there. That there was, I was able to get certain factual information, but it didn't necessarily give me the result I wanted. So one of the things in relationship to the start of the movement, looking when for example, did UKIP have their first website? The earliest I could tell was 2000, but I certainly know from other correspondence that there's something predates that. It was at least 1999. So that original first website is not there. So I have a broader answer, but not a specific answer. I have an indication that there are differences between the local and the central in terms of different number of websites, URLs, but I don't have, I can't map the bigger project. I have examples, but not a sense of the overall picture. I wasn't able to get that. In qualitative terms, I had some interesting results, as I've indicated, but they were largely serendipitous. If I could read my own handwriting here, now I know exactly what my last, yeah, I mean, in that sense, I'm not quite, I think in terms of the research there, what a clear question that, a clear conclusion that I had was that I couldn't depend on using research via the web archive on its own to draw conclusions. It had to be supplemented and complemented with more traditional types of research in terms of the archives, in terms of newspapers, etc. I'll leave it there. Anybody have any questions for me? We'll stick to form in that regard, and I'll pass over now to Peter.
Thank you, Richard. So the first thing to say about my particular research project, was actually that it didn't touch. There's no full text search element to it. There's no element of examining individual sites at all. And so I didn't use the Shine interface at all. What I did use instead was one of the derived data sets that I mentioned before from that the BL have provided. In particular, specifically what's known as the host link graph, which is just a very, very, very large file of lines that tell you that in a particular, of all the resources captured in a particular year, 1996, say, or 2010, in such and such a site or such and such a host, there were X number of individual pages or resources that linked to this other host, basically. So it just demonstrates in a very, very abstracted way what linked to what at what point in time. And so my own background is as I'm interested in contemporary religious history. I'm particularly interested in conservative religious movements in the UK. And so I'm particularly interested in actually what happened in the strength of creationist thinking within the British churches. And so just to recap, creationism, broadly speaking, is a belief in non-evolutionary explanations of human origins. It's actually a surprisingly modern movement within British Christianity. That's to say that it isn't simply a transposition forward of pre-modern ways of understanding the world, but it actually it dates very quite clearly from the turn of the early years of the 20th century. And by and large, it's a feature of the evangelical wing of the churches, but historically has been really quite a marginal position even within those. And so, what I wanted to get a sense of was actually in the last nearly 20 years, actually how strong is the UK creationist movement in relation to other creationists around the world, because the established, if there is one, the established narrative within the scholarship is that UK creationism is very, very weak and actually draws much of its strength from others, particularly in the United States and particularly in Australia. So in the web context, it was possible to see, so I took 4 individual, prominent and actually the most long-standing creationist organisations, and just had a look through all of this data to see what linked to their sites and at what time. And so actually, I mentioned that the data set has a couple of billion lines in it. My laptop, which is not a very expensive one, takes about an hour or so to run through it all. So it's not a major operation, and the bit of code that you need on the command line to do it didn't extend over more than 2 lines. It's about a couple of hundred characters. And so the first question was actually, was it true to say that actually and I also say that I also looked at outgoing links. So where was it that those individual creationist sites, what was it that they were linking to, in a sense? So actually to read the link as a proxy for attention, and so we can talk a bit about exactly what a link might mean a little bit later on. So that was the first question: how strong are they? And the second one, which is related to it, actually picks up on some of a broader question about the way that the web behaves more generally, and it's actually got picks up on a couple of things that Gareth and Richard have both said. From the very, if you look at the first president of one of the first established UK creationist site was already complaining in the 1930s that people of his persuasion found it impossible to get their work published in mainstream scientific journals. They found it impossible to find speaking platforms. They could only get their work published if they were prepared to pay for it themselves. That mainstream publishers wouldn't touch it. And so this narrative of being deliberately ostracised and ignored established itself very early within the British creationist movement. And so the question is, actually, was that still the case in the web context? That's to say, if I looked at inbound links from mainstream media and from the academy, from the .ac.uk domain, was that the case? And by and large, the conclusion was that yes, it still was. Which brings us on to a slightly more kind of meta question about how the web works. Part of that narrative, you would say that if it were the case that the creationist view was actually very powerful and persuasive, if it could only get a voice, if it only had the oxygen of publicity, then it would take off and it would achieve the success that it had been craving, but just that it had been excluded by the publicity, by the way that printed publication worked. So if that was the case, if the web was a spontaneous attention generator in that sense, then actually one should see an efflorescence of attention paid to these creationist sites from within it. And so the question is, was that actually the case or not? And the answer is no, that wasn't really the case either. So by and large, the proportion of the individual churches that I would have most expected to see linking to this content, if it was actually gaining the traction one would expect, was actually very, very small indeed. So by and large, if minority movements are going to take off in the web context, it takes more than their implicit plausibility and attractiveness as an idea. So basically, that's more or less what I had to say. But I've got various method points we can come back to, Richard.
Anybody have any questions specifically for Peter, or indeed for any of our experiences or comments? Please, we'll start.
I've got a question about the different experience of searching for official social organisations web pages and doing what you were doing, looking more about communities and poetry forums and things, and if those are two different things, and whether it's the kind of vibe I'm getting is that looking at kind of user-generated or discussion forums is harder, and I'm not sure about permissions and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so as Gareth said, there's definitely a problem with trying to search for words such as names that can be different things. Like, for example, if you search for Adrian near poet, you're going to get Adrian Mitchell. If you search for Henry near painter, you're going to get Henri Matisse. You know, these, as I said, they're not false results, but they aren't useful to your specific research. What I found is, in terms of looking at discussion forums, as opposed to individual names of people and trying to find the discussion forums by searching for names that might be coming up, was that actually I started off with some ideas of what I was looking for. Like, I knew that the Oxford University Poetry Society had a website, and I did a lot of research where I was looking for things I already knew existed, and then what did they link to? And I found new things. I found the Poetry Forum, which aptly named, it's just called thepoetryforum.co.uk. You know, I found them by doing a live web search for poetry forums, which I could then put back into the Internet Archive. So you have to sort of be quite savvy about what you want to find and what you know you can already find, and from there finding things that you didn't know existed.
Just to follow up on that, one thing that, having done this initial search for these 4 known organisations, which actually it was precisely the kind of sort of predetermining of the question that Gareth was mentioning about, but what has in fact revealed for me is a whole load of other sites that I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And so what I've then done is I've then fed. I went through all the unique ones and actually just checked out what they were. Some of them I know what the bbc.co.uk is, and so on and so forth. I know there are things I know. There are other sites I hadn't seen before, so I had to go back to either to the live web or actually to the Wayback Machine to see if I could identify and classify what they were. And actually, so my sense of the spread of the network of creationist organisations online has grown, because I found a whole lot of inbound stuff, and now I chuck that list back into the script and do the same. And so it's an iterative process, that I will do the same inbound link exercise with all of the other ones that I found to see whether, in fact, the 4 organisations I originally identified were in fact not where the action was, where there's actually other sites who were actually getting much more traction, but I just didn't know they were there. So it's kind of, there is all of this is kind of an iterative process of refining, of hypothesising, refining a hypothesis, continuing to work through it.
One of the side effects of doing that, however, is that you're still looking for organisations or websites which are a collection of things. I think, going back to sort of the original premise of the question, that finding individual people who might have written 1 or 2 individual things about a particular topic is incredibly difficult to sort out. I think if you can find dedicated blogs or forums or websites that pertain to either an individual trying to build their own brand or an organisation, it becomes more easy, because you've got more sort of data points, I think, to be able to triangulate onto what you're looking for. But if you're just looking for individual mentions on if you just want somebody shouting about Germans, that's going to be more difficult, I think, to find than trying to find an organisation specifically tailored to shouting at Germans.
Which in a sense is where you could start to triangulate full text search with the link analysis, such that actually if you're in your full text search you find one host linking to a site that's about shouting at Germans, then you can work backwards and then figure it out. Yeah. So even if you don't find it in the search result, you might find the link. So there's actually there's also a process of doing more than one type of inquiry within this and triangulating the different results.
Just unfortunately, Helen has to leave. Do you have to leave now? Because what I was going to suggest, Helen, was I've got there's 3 questions I saw there. If you each give your question, and if Helen has a response to any of those, then so please.
Okay. So I've got a number of questions. I mean, the first is that it would be really useful to have the names of the panels and sort of your background, that slide up on screen.
Sure.
But
Point taken.
Sophie, for Helen, I'm interested in where the information that you ultimately gather in terms of your research, where that goes. Is that fed back in some way to the poets? Does it remain within the academy? In other words, it's a really interesting piece of work. But I'm just wondering, when you've gathered the information, where does it sit or where does it go?
So the aspect of the this that I did do something with is during the ARDA process. I was still doing my PhD, and I used a lot of the results that I'd found of people talking in the same way that I used the interviews that I had conducted myself as part of my PhD research. So I did use it in my PhD work, and it was very useful, and a lot of it was serendipitous, but I did find useful results which I could then use that were no longer on the live web or that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. My work that I did with Buddha, with Poetry Networks, was it ended up being a bit of an end in itself. Honestly, I haven't gone anywhere with it, but I am still interested in the idea of Poetry Networks. And does that answer your question?
Yeah. So is that okay? I've got sort of almost a question.
I don't know whether. Well, I just want to see
just
for Helen before
Sorry,
she's got to go.
sorry.
Francesca, did you have a question?
Just more a general one. How difficult was it to actually run all of these searches? Was it through your own computers? I mean, in terms of the infrastructure that you need to do, would you, if you want to do this kind of research? Looking especially an audience of PhD students.
Yeah,
So
I did all my research on my computer, but I know that the MOD research that Harry did, he downloaded the derived dataset and a derived dataset for that, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
And he did that on his own computer as well.
I think it's more important to have a network connection.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, none of the data that we're talking about today is all either available via a web interface or will fit on the averagely sized hard disk on a desktop machine.
Helen, did you have anything that relates to Helen?
I guess I have a question. I'm
Okay,
just
I don't know.
listening to you, thinking about what we might be able to do, to help to some extent. I think the what Gareth said about consistency in the method, so a fixed way, almost, or definable way to get to corpus or corpora. I'm thinking, might it be helpful to think of things like you start with a website you know about, relevant to your topic, then we say, define a period of time, we give you 100 random samples which contain that search term, or link to those websites as a starter. Then you have a slice, and that might be manageable. And is that sort of thing, that sort of functions, from a service point of view, would that be helpful? Because I actually do realise the sort of problems you currently have. The full text search is the only way, and the facets to filter further is the only way for you to find the material, and you really don't know what you filtered out is not useful. That's another problem, I think, in this. So you think you have found something useful, but you're actually not sure that you have what you have discarded are not useful. So.
Helen, if you want to say anything, do.
I
Otherwise,
know-
we'll thank you very much.
I know you did a lot of work on sampling, so I'll sort of hand it over to you. But I say that when we worked with ARDA, as I said, we only had 10% of the data available, and it was a random 10%, but I definitely found, working on that random 10% and then working on the 100%, that it wasn't a representative sample, if you see what I mean. So yeah, a sample could be useful, but then again, you don't know what the other data involves.
That's what I'm thinking, sampling.
Sorry, and
Thank you very
bye.
much.
See.
Even though it's a misnomer, what does it literally mean? Because I'm not obviously with the digital background, does that mean what, in the sense of unknown?
Oh, so
Is that
I mean,
associated?
I mean, it's only dark in the sense. So it's available either through the Shine interface or via these various derived datasets I mentioned. It's dark in the sense that A, it hasn't been used a great deal by scholars, and B, in that actually that we as scholars, we're still trying to establish what to do with it and what the methodological implications of being in it are. So the dark in a sense doesn't imply anything about whether you can get hold of it, it's about what we know about it.
Probably the opposite of transparent.
Yeah, and shining and light, okay, so yeah.
I think that was accidental, but yeah, that's apt, and I think we should use that more.
I think you missed an opportunity to call it the Darkive.
So yeah, that was the sort of overarching, but what you were saying as well earlier, Richard, about sort of prior knowledge, and Peter, I'm really interested in your work, and you said that perhaps if there's time you'd talk about your methodology, which would be really, really interesting. But in terms of, this is not digital as such, but how do you approach these sort of, I don't know, sort of in terms of understanding movements? Because I know there's been a whole range of sort of debates about whether such a thing exists and what is it and what does it look like. But when you use the phrase creationist movements, what do you mean, and how did that inform your sort of archival search?
Well, in a sense, I took quite a Catholic definition of creationist to mean to also to encompass the movement that's known as intelligent design as well. So there are various types and variations on the theme, but all of them are concerned with squaring a literalistic reading of the first chapter of the book of Genesis so that's the field that I had in mind. And the initial sample I took was actually the 4 organisations which were first established in the UK for promoting that, which date from were formed in the 30s, 2 of them in the 70s and 1 in the 80s. And so there's a print literature about that earlier history, a historiography there already to work with.
Gav, just to say, it's not even a question, but just to say that, again, thank you almost for the reminder that with lots of research, and I'm sure it's the same with sort of archival, there's a tendency to sort of go really wide and, sort of end up down a rabbit hole, but going back to the first principles of what is it that you're interested in, what is it that you're trying to find out, so that's sort of pulling back and going back to that. So I want to say thank you for that as a reminder, because I'm already very early in my sort of research career, but just aware of how easy it is to go sort of far, far away from the original, as I say, first principles. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's allowed historians, or maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just a bad historian, but one of the things that's allowed us to kind of go, well, this is interesting, let's see where it goes, is the fact that with the work that I've done so far in my admittedly short career, it's tended to be curated archives. There has been an archivist, or there have been processes in place which have meant that we have these things catalogued in a particular place, with that be, whether that be government files, organisations themselves that have set up their own archives, those sorts of things. And where I have gone into something that hasn't been catalogued, it's been going to a specific organisation and looking at the old stuff that they've got in the back of their office. There is a finite amount of stuff, and even that stuff that has survived for a reason, because the organisation themselves has determined what is worth holding on to. With the internet, there is no curation whatsoever. Everything, well, it's not even that everything is still there, it's just that we have a bunch of stuff which happens to have survived, and there is no sense of a collection of stuff which relates to a particular topic or a particular person, or that it is, in any way sort of really, there's no order to this sort of chaos, really. And I think we sometimes, one of the reasons why we need to be reminded of it is because we also need to be reminded that traditional print physical archives are also problematic. They also contain a number of sort of real problems with them. It's just that we're more willing to accept them because we've been dealing with them for 300 years and don't have to worry.
Can I amplify that a bit in the sense actually that holds absolutely true for this bigger data set that we've been talking about primarily today, but actually the UK Web Archive actually has a whole load of curated collections as well, which do have a human intelligence behind them. So I showed David Cameron's campaign site earlier on. That's part of a general election 2005 collection, which has as many of those campaign sites as they could find, and news coverage and opinion polls and all the rest of it. So that is a curated web archive, which is usable in different ways. You will only find in there what was deemed to be important at the time, but it will be more useful for other things. Whereas actually, if you're in the wild web, as it were. There's a new phrase, it's a new one. Then actually that gives you different challenges but different possibilities as well.
Yeah, I mean, the distinction is, isn't it, between those curated ones? Somebody has assembled it together and made various decisions in the same way that either a business archive or a personal archive has done exactly as Gareth said, made a decision what to retain, what to throw away, and what to put into it or not. And that mimics the traditional ways in which institutions like the British Library or National Archives or whatever assemble their data, group it, and structure it then give it the, to use the technical term, the metadata, all those kind of characters. Whereas the web, as it, when it's scrawled, you just get what's there.
Can I just add that the challenge for us is actually knowing where we, apply that traditional approach and use our resources, because for us the web is too big to do that sort of thing to every single website as well. So we need to know that, and I don't think we know. So for the time being, we focus on important events, of national interest.
Because building on that, in a sense, actually, under legal deposit for print, the BL and the other legal deposit libraries get a copy of everything printed, but everything is catalogued, right? Because actually the size of it is relatively manageable. But the first domain crawl of the UK domain turned up just north of 4 million individual sites. So they'll never all be catalogued, right? There's you need a small army of curators, and they'd only get it done, and the following year there'd be another 5 million to do. So we will have to live with this as a way of accessing this material that we'll only be able to find our way into it by searching it or doing these other things with it. So actually it's an archive by and large without a traditional catalogue.
Sorry, I was just going to ask though, to put it crudely, a lot of people are using the internet for things like pornography and things like that I don't think are being catalogued or not even saved in any way. So what is the status with not just the important events that are being saved, but the majority of stuff that people are looking at in this day and age, which is pornography, social media, things like that? Is that not savable?
So Helen will correct me. There are two parts of that. That actually, in these once yearly crawls of the whole domain, anything that Helen's team know is from within the UK according to various criteria is captured. So that will include all the cat pictures and all the porn and everything, right? There's a separate issue with social media because it's very difficult to know what's in scope. And so we could go into the complexities of that if you like, but actually knowing because Twitter.com is a American site, Facebook is an American site, and so pulling out what falls within the UK legislation is not straightforward. So there are kind of two bits going on.
Because in terms of social media, we're not treating them differently as a resource on the web. So because they fall outside the current legal definition of UK content, so systematically, so because Twitter.com is not there, and it's not .uk, it's not hosted, it doesn't meet the territoriality criteria. However, if someone can manually identify a Twitter account belonging to a UK person, then it will be picked up. So the extent to which social media is archived really depend on the effort going into it to identify them as in scope. And that, for the time being, is only happening with that manual effort. Therefore, there are social media content in there, but not a large amount.
Just that as well, the passwords getting away a lot as well. So anything's password protected, anything you log in to see
Oh, that's not
won't be captured either. So there's kind of two or many more reasons why social media is particularly tricky.
So there are quite a lot of Twitter pages and Facebook pages in relation to the election that's just happened, because human beings picked them out and said these belong to prospective parliamentary candidates. And so that's it. So it's just that human intervention that Helen mentioned.
Any other questions or comments at this point? Right, I indicated.
No, so
go on. Sorry. Excuse me. You didn't quite. You got to wave.
Since we started talking a bit about special collections, this is what I'm going to be working on during my short time here. What do you see as being the differences in the way you would use that as a research collection in comparison to using the whole archive? Do you like a couple of main points?
I mean, it seems to me that it would be so to take the recent general election collection. It would be quite a good candidate for sentiment analysis and other kind of text mining tools, because you can be confident that the bulk of the content is focusing on the same issues, and so the occurrence of Cameron probably is mostly political and it's not about a type of tartan or other instances of Cameron. So there are some elements to that, but one's critical antennae always need to be up to say that actually clearly this was selected, this is curated, there's a human intelligence behind what's in here and what isn't here, and you're unlikely to find much serendipitous stuff that lies on the margins and connected with that bunch of content. So it's just the tools are the same, I think, but the questions you can ask are rather different.
The scope is, of course, something else, because usually, correct me if I'm wrong, they're not. How large are some of the created collections? They're often relatively small, and so in that sense, you could actually go through the whole of the collection. That is feasible, for some of them at least, anyways, if not all of them. Yeah, which in that way, the problem I had was just too many results, and there's the impossibility of dealing with all those. So I had to develop strategies or methodologies for sampling or for looking at aspects of it.
I think as well, I think it's probably worth saying as well that there was a difference between us doing these Buddha projects where we were looking at specific things, specifically using the web archive, and what you would do for a wider research project. I mean, if I was using the election databases, I would be looking for, sentiment analysis. I'd be looking to see which words popped up more than anything, to see what were the big topics that people were, what the candidates thought were the big topics for on the local and national level. And then you'd move on from that, and you'd try to find as much as possible what quote unquote normal people were saying on the internet about candidates, about particular parties, maybe what the news sites were saying about particular parties and particular candidates, and you'd be bringing all of this information in, and then using newspapers and traditional media as well. I think the difference really is, as you would do with any research, is making sure that you contextualise what the source is that you're using, and saying, okay, we can only draw these conclusions from it because all sources are flawed, but these are the particular strengths and weaknesses of this particular source, and using the other bits to try and, as best as possible, fill the holes.
And I think just one of the other ones that I think probably you'd end up doing is exploring is much more the link to and the link from.
Yeah.
Which I think can be very, very interesting in trying to get those connections between websites. I certainly think that you'd be able to get a much more rounded and a fuller appreciation of that, the bigger picture, that you don't necessarily get when you only look at some.
Wasn't because I mean, sort of related to this, but not entirely the same. There was a paper given at the Digital Humanities Seminar, wasn't there, where somebody had done pretty much this, but with 19th century election material. Is that correct? And they'd worked out that a lot of people had said that Ireland was a big issue in the 19th century, and he sort of said, well, somebody better tell the candidates because they weren't talking about it in their manifestos.
Yeah, he used newspaper resources. Yeah, he went through and used newspaper resources. And
yeah, not the 19th century web.
No.
Well, their version.
Yeah.